Childhood. It's supposed to be a time of wonder, of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and wide-eyed innocence. But what happens when that innocence is nothing more than a mask? When behind those bright eyes and schoolyard smiles hides something darker? We expect violence from adults. We brace ourselves for stories of hardened criminals, career killers, and disturbed minds warped over time. But when the hand that holds the knife is barely big enough to grip it, that's when our sense of safety shatters. The idea that a child could take a life, not in a moment of panic or confusion, but with clear intent, it's almost unthinkable. And yet, it's happened. Not once, not twice, but many times throughout history. Cases that haunt detectives, that puzzle psychologists, and that force us to ask one of the most disturbing questions imaginable. Can a child be evil? In this video, we're diving headfirst into that question, not with theory, but with cold, hard stories. The real lives of real children who killed. You'll hear about an 11-year-old girl who strangled 2 toddlers and then smiled as she watched the investigation unfold. A teenage boy who began killing at just 13 and described his murders with laughter and pride. A quiet, red-headed boy with freckles who lured a 4-year-old into the woods and did something no child ever should. A girl who helped slaughter her own family and claimed it was out of love. These aren't just rare exceptions, they're warnings. Each one a window into the unimaginable, into what can happen when something, whether born or broken, twists inside a child. Because the scariest part? These weren't children from horror movies. They were classmates, neighbors, kids who rode bikes and watched cartoons. But when the time came, they showed no mercy. And the world was left asking, were they created by trauma, shaped by neglect? Or were they just different from the start? These cases don't offer easy answers. In fact, they leave us with more questions about how we raise children, about how we define accountability, about how we understand evil, and when it begins. As we move through each chapter, we'll uncover chilling evidence. Hear the words of the killers. If you've ever thought you've seen the darkest side of humanity, buckle up. Because this story is going to take you places no horror movie dares to go. And it all begins with one name, 4, Mary Bell, the child who killed without remorse. On May 25th, 1968, in the quiet town of Scotswood, England, the body of a 4-year-old boy was found in an abandoned house. He had been strangled. At first, police believed it was a tragic accident, perhaps other children playing rough. But when the second boy turned up dead just 2 months later, in eerily similar circumstances, the truth became undeniable. A killer was on the loose, and that killer was just 11 years old. Her name was Mary Bell. Blonde, with big blue eyes and a delicate frame, Mary looked like any other child on the outside, but inside she harbored something far more sinister. She was charming, articulate, and oddly composed for her age. But she was also manipulative, violent, and completely void of empathy. Before the murders, Mary had already shown signs of disturbing behavior. She was known to be cruel to animals, aggressive with other kids, and obsessed with death. Teachers noticed her dark drawings. Neighbors whispered about her strange moods, but no one could have predicted what she was truly capable of. On the day of the first murder, Mary lured Martin Brown, just 4 years old, into an abandoned house. What happened next is still hard to process. She strangled him with her bare hands. There were no signs of sexual assault, no motive that made sense, just cold, deliberate violence. But what's even more chilling is what happened after Mary returned to the scene of the crime. She watched the police investigate. She even broke into a nursery with her friend and left a note that read, "I murder so that I may come back." At school, she told classmates she had seen the body. She described the scene in disturbing detail. Most thought she was just making it up. But Mary knew exactly what she was doing. She was playing a game, and no one suspected her. 2 months later, she struck again. This time, the victim was Brian Howe, a 3-year-old boy. Again, she strangled him. But this time, it was worse. She mutilated the body with scissors, carving an M into his stomach. And when the police questioned neighborhood kids, Mary actually volunteered to help with the search, knowing full well where Brian's body lay. She even pointed investigators toward the wrong area, pretending to be helpful. But what gave her away was her obsession with the details. Mary mentioned things about the body that only the killer could have known. It didn't take long for police to connect the dots. When they brought her in for questioning, Mary didn't cry. She didn't plead. She sat calmly, coldly, and slowly unraveled the truth. Her friend Norma Bell, no relation, was also arrested, though it became clear Mary had been the mastermind. Norma was confused and frightened. Mary, on the other hand, was composed, calculating, and oddly proud. During the trial, the world watched in disbelief as this small, soft-spoken girl was described by psychologists as a sociopath in the making. She showed no remorse, no emotion, and when the jury found her guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, she was just 12 years old. The British press exploded. How could a child do such a thing? What had created this monster? As details of Mary's home life surfaced, the picture became even more horrifying. Mary's mother was a sex worker who reportedly forced her into disturbing situations from a very young age. She suffered emotional, physical, and sexual abuse throughout her childhood. She was neglected, unloved, and exposed to violence before she could even read. It raised the question, was Mary born evil? Or was she made that way? Mary Bell was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite sentence designed for juvenile offenders. She served 12 years in custody. At 23, she was released and given a new identity. She eventually had a daughter of her own, who reportedly didn't know her mother's past until the media exposed it. Today, Mary Bell lives under legal anonymity, protected by the courts despite her crimes. But the memory of what she did has never faded. The photographs of Brian Howe's carved body, the child-sized fingerprints around Martin Brown's neck, the emotionless stare of an 11-year-old killer. Mary Bell's case is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always grow slowly over time. Sometimes it shows up early, and when it does, it wears the most innocent disguise of all. 3. John Venables and Robert Thompson, Evil in Pairs. February 12, 1993. It was a regular day at the New Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, England. Mothers walked with their children. Stores buzzed with chatter. And somewhere in the crowd, two boys were stalking their prey. John Venables and Robert Thompson were both just 10 years old. Not teenagers, not even close, 10. Children, in every sense of the word. But by the end of that day, they would commit one of the most chilling crimes in British history. Their victim was James Bulger, a toddler just 2 years old. He had wandered slightly from his mother while they were in a butcher shop. In that brief, unguarded moment, John and Robert made their move. They took James by the hand, led him out of the shopping center, and into the cold. CCTV footage captured the three of them walking, two older boys, one tiny child in tow. At a glance, it might have looked innocent, but what followed was anything but. For over 2 miles, John and Robert led James Bulger through busy streets, along a canal, across train tracks. Multiple people saw them. Some even stopped and asked questions. But the boys claimed James was their little brother. No one imagined what they were really doing. The torture began long before they reached their final destination. They kicked James, threw bricks at him, dropped him on his head repeatedly. One witness reported seeing James crying, covered in bruises, his face bloodied, yet still being led along by the two boys. Eventually, they arrived at a secluded railway line, and that's where the horror reached its peak. What happened next is nearly unspeakable. They continued to beat him, savagely. They threw paint in his eyes, stuffed batteries into his mouth, and finally they dropped a 22-pound iron bar on his head. James Bulger was just a toddler, barely old enough to talk. He died alone, in agony, surrounded by children who should have been his protectors, not his murderers. To make things worse, John and Robert tried to stage the scene, laying James's body across the railway tracks, hoping a passing train would make it look like an accident. They left him there and went home, as if nothing had happened. When James's body was discovered 2 days later, the nation was gripped with horror. Who could do something so vicious to a child? No one expected the answer to be two schoolboys. But after investigators reviewed hours of CCTV footage and followed dozens of tips, the truth came out. John Venables and Robert Thompson were arrested, and the world saw what pure evil looked like in miniature. During interrogation, both boys tried to blame each other. They cried, they panicked, but neither showed true remorse. When police laid out the evidence, the paint on James's face matching John's stolen can, the bricks, the iron bar, the story was clear. This was not a childish accident. It was murder. At trial, the courtroom was filled with shock and fury. The boys were described as cold, calculating, and disturbingly detached. James's parents, devastated, demanded justice, and the British public erupted with rage. John and Robert were found guilty of murder and sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. They became the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. They were both 10 years old when they took a life. But the story didn't end there. In 2001, after serving just 8 years, they were released with new identities and given lifetime anonymity. The public outcry was immense. Many believed they hadn't served nearly enough time for what they did. Since then, John Venables has been rearrested multiple times for possessing disturbing child abuse images, reigniting public outrage and questions about his true nature. Robert Thompson, on the other hand, has remained hidden, silent. His whereabouts and behavior are unknown. But what lingers most from this case is the pure senselessness of it. James Bulger didn't know his killers. He never had a chance. And the boys who ended his life did it for no reason, other than because they could. It forces us to ask, how does something so dark grow in children so young? 2. The Parker Hume case, a murderous friendship, New Zealand. 1954. A sunny, peaceful day in Christchurch, or so it seemed. For 2 girls, it would become a day that changed everything. The murder of Honora Parker, the mother of one of the girls, Pauline Parker, wasn't just a crime. It was an act of pure betrayal, a final, violent result of a toxic, obsessive friendship that spiraled into madness. Pauline, a shy, 16-year-old girl, and Juliet Hume, 15, seemed like an unlikely pair. Pauline was quiet, withdrawn. Juliet, on the other hand, was charismatic, rebellious, and far more outspoken. But the two quickly became inseparable. The bond they shared was intense, too intense for their age. To outsiders, it was a strange friendship. Their mutual obsession with one another was unusual, even unhealthy. But in the confines of their own world, it was a private, all-consuming love. A love that would soon be tested by reality. The problem? Pauline's mother, Honora. Honora was an overbearing, controlling figure in her daughter's life. The 2 girls, who were already alienated from their families and society, saw Honora as a barrier, a threat to their intense, exclusive friendship. In the weeks leading up to the murder, the relationship between Pauline and her mother had become increasingly strained. Pauline had expressed her desire to run away with Juliet, to escape the confines of her mother's smothering influence. But Honora forbade it, punishing Pauline for even thinking about leaving. The tension was palpable. The girls were trapped, feeling suffocated by the world they were forced to live in. Then came the plan. Juliet, with her sharp intellect and persuasive nature, convinced Pauline that they needed to eliminate the obstacle that stood between them. Honora. It was not an impulsive thought. No, it had been brewing for months, perhaps even years. Honora had to go. On June 22, 1944, Pauline and Juliet lured Honora into a quiet, secluded area of the park. The plan was set, the act premeditated. They used a wooden brick, a heavy object, to deliver fatal blows to Honora's skull. But what makes this case so haunting isn't just the violence. It's the bizarre, emotional detachment displayed by both girls. There were no tears, no regret, no fear. Pauline later recounted how, after the murder, she and Juliet simply went for a walk in the park, as if nothing had happened, as if life continued on. It was as if the act of killing Honora had been justified. It wasn't until the following day that the girls were caught. Their strange behavior raised suspicions. Their attempts to cover up the crime only made things worse. And when Pauline and Juliet were finally questioned, the truth came out. But even then, neither girl showed any remorse. Juliet even took the stand at trial, reciting a flawless performance of cool detachment, as if the murder had been a mere accident. The two girls would later be sentenced to detention for 5 years, a sentence considered shockingly light for the brutality of the crime. What made the case even more disturbing was the intensity of their relationship. The psychologists who assessed the girls noted that they didn't view their actions as wrong. They saw Honora's death as a necessary step to preserve their relationship. They viewed each other as soulmates, two halves of one whole, and in their minds, Honora was the one who had to be removed. They claimed they had been driven by uncontrollable passion and that their love for each other had turned into an obsession, one that they believed could only be fulfilled by murder. The Parker Hume case was groundbreaking, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the intense psychological breakdown it revealed. What happens when two children, living in an isolated world, come to believe that there are no boundaries, that their love for each other transcends all other moral obligations? And what do you do when these children are unrepentant, when they show no signs of guilt, no comprehension of the gravity of their actions? Pauline and Juliet were eventually released from detention, though they were separated for years afterward. Pauline later changed her name and lived a quiet life under a new identity. Juliet, on the other hand, went on to have a successful career as a novelist, but remained haunted by the fact that she was forever tied to a murder that the world would never forget. The Parker Hume case remains one of the most unsettling true crime stories of the 20th century, not because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the chilling insight it gives into the psychology of children. A friendship that could have been innocent, but wasn't. A bond that led to murder. 1. The Sasebo slashing, a schoolgirl's rage. On June 1st, 2004, in the quiet coastal city of Sasebo, Japan, a crime unfolded that would shake the entire nation. But this crime wasn't committed by an adult, a criminal mastermind, or even someone seeking revenge. It was carried out by a 14-year-old schoolgirl. Her name was Miyu Moriyama, and her victim was Satomi Mitarai, a classmate at the same school. To the outside world, they appeared to be ordinary teenage girls. They were both just students living in a peaceful town. But behind the veil of normalcy, there was something far darker. The relationship between Miyu and Satomi seemed innocent enough at first. But like many of the most disturbing cases of youth violence, it was the buildup of hidden emotions, jealousy, bitterness, and resentment that eventually exploded in a horrific act of violence. Miyu had always been an outsider. She was quiet, introverted, and struggled to fit in. But Satomi was different. She was more popular, outgoing, and well-liked by their classmates. This disparity created a toxic environment, one where Miyu began to harbor deep resentment towards Satomi. But the tension wasn't obvious to anyone else. The two girls had been close friends, spending time together outside of school. However, something changed in their dynamic. Miyu began to feel betrayed by Satomi, who, in her eyes, had disrespected her by making new friends and distancing herself from their friendship. As the weeks went on, the emotional strain between them grew. But what would happen next, what Miyu did next, would horrify the world. On the morning of June 1st, 2004, the two girls entered the school together. Satomi had no idea what was about to happen. Miyu, on the other hand, had a plan. She waited for an opportunity, and when they were alone in the classroom, Miyu attacked Satomi. Armed with a kitchen knife she had smuggled from home, Miyu slashed at Satomi's neck and face, stabbing her multiple times. The brutality was shocking. Satomi's life was violently ended, and she was left lying in a pool of her own blood. But what's truly chilling about this crime is not just the violence. It's Miyu's demeanor after the attack. After slashing Satomi, Miyu calmly walked out of the classroom and went straight to a teacher. She said, "I've killed Satomi." There was no fear, no remorse, just a cold, almost matter-of-fact statement. As the teacher rushed to the scene and discovered the horror, Miyu didn't flinch. She was arrested and later explained in her confession that she had planned the attack for days. The reason? She couldn't bear to see Satomi thriving while she felt left behind. As the details of the crime emerged, it became clear that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. Miyu had been carefully plotting the murder, convinced that it was the only way to eliminate the source of her pain. When she was questioned by police, Miyu admitted that she had long felt an overwhelming jealousy towards Satomi's happiness and social standing. But what was more disturbing than the jealousy itself was the lack of empathy. Miyu didn't show any sorrow for what she had done. Instead, she seemed detached, almost numb to the gravity of the situation. She was simply angry at Satomi for being too perfect, and in her mind, taking her life was the only way to restore balance. As Miyu's trial began, the country was left grappling with a shocking question. What could drive a child to murder another child so violently? This case sparked debates in Japan and around the world about the mental and emotional lives of young people. What was it about Miyu's upbringing and her relationship with Satomi that made her capable of such rage? What caused this quiet, withdrawn girl to carry out a brutal murder? The psychological evaluations that followed suggested that Miyu had been isolated for much of her life, struggling to connect with others. Her emotional development was stunted, and she had developed distorted views of relationships, seeing them as competitive, zero-sum games rather than partnerships. But even with these insights, the core of the crime remains disturbingly simple. Jealousy, resentment, anger. Miyu was convicted of murder and sentenced to a detention facility, where she would serve her sentence until she reached adulthood. She became one of the youngest individuals in Japan to be convicted of such a violent crime. And as the case faded from the headlines, the world was left with one chilling truth: that sometimes violence comes from a place so deep within, so hidden from view, that no one sees it until it's too late. If you've found these stories as unsettling and thought-provoking as we did, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video with others who need to hear these chilling truths. We've got plenty more true crime stories lined up, where we'll be uncovering even more disturbing mysteries that you won't want to miss.